Okay, so I can see I have my topic here, Barry Dungeons and Dragons Club Feasibility of a D&D elementary school program study. Not the best title, but I can live with it. And this is my topic. It'll be equivalent to your topic. I've made the topics fairly esoteric and a tad bit unusual. I wanted to keep them that way because makes it a little harder to design because there is not going to be any existing research. So I may think, oh, well, I'll just go find stuff on buried Dungeons and Dragons and elementary schools. Well, there will likely be nothing. So what you have to do is, and you'll get better at this. But the place to start is where can I find some quick literature on research on Dungeons and Dragons? So I can approach this in two ways. I can approach this in research on Dungeons and Dragons, and I can approach it from using Dungeons and Dragons in schools or education. Okay, so I open up my web browser. Let's start again here. I want Google Scholar. It's always a nice place to start. Library resources will be probably more comprehensive, but for free, and just to get some quick hits to get you started and get the ball rolling on your research. So Google Scholar, Dungeons, and let's use the and Dragons. Okay, so let's just look and see what we get. Well, here's very quickly a use of a fantasy game in the psychotherapeutic treatment of a young adult. Interesting. And I can keep looking. Nothing's really caught my eye yet. Well, this one looks a little interesting. Banned in prison. Aha. I struck it lucky here. Using Dungeons and Dragons to integrate curricula in an elementary classroom. Boom. Let's check this out. Okay, let's blow it up a bit. How can an elementary teacher integrate a set math program with social studies in literature and writing? So I will trace the development of a year-long project undertaken with my third grade math students that addresses this challenge. Okay. So here's a description of what he did. I don't see any other literature. Oh, here we go. Greg recent others inspired by the use gaming philosophers Lev Vygotsky and Jean Piaget, two leaders in developmental psych. Here's a topic I can look at if I want to look at something even more specific than Dungeons and Dragons. I can look at fantasy play. Okay, so that's a good start. What I'll want to do is I want to save this article. And I can put this in my folder. Let's see. And I'll call it D&D. I'll usually just give them a research study. Okay. Now, this is let me a term. Um, is fantasy. So I'm going back here. Okay. So I might decide, okay, let's look up in a very general sense. Let's go to Google Scholar again. So fantasy play in elementary school. Oh, I'm not in Google Scholar. Okay. Oh, fantasy play in elementary. And I may want to look at something more recent since 2016. There's no, this one won't have a site, like a PDF. So that might be interesting. Okay, this looks interesting. I don't have access to it. This article here from Sage Journals, I would want to see if I can get that through the library. This one looks interesting. Okay, I think I'm just going to have to, let's put quotes. It's got to have fantasy play in it. Okay, fantasy play right here. So there's a good. So I guess there was a download for that one. Okay, so play is a word used commonly to refer to children's preferred activities. What and how do children learn through play? Okay, so we're looking at fantasy role playing games. So this is play in the at school. This gives a real history. This is interesting. Mixed age, age mixed play. So having something you could try looking at Dungeons and Dragons across ages, and join them together. This is interesting too. Concept of the decline in children's play. Okay, so I like this. It's a very general article on play and fantasy play and its importance. So it's a good start. Oh, I should save it. Sorry. This one's a web page, so I'd have to. I can save as. I'll say it was web page complete. Save. Guess I've kept that article. Okay. And then back to my D&D. So I'm kind of like on two paths here, just fantasy play in general. Self-reflection skills. There won't be an article for this. I mean, there won't be. I won't have a download for it, but I would try and find this through the library. So you're starting to look at issues that are important. Like, why would you want to have Dungeons and Dragons in the school? Well, fantasy play looks to be important, and there's good. We found a source for that, and find multiple sources. And now we have here that fantasy play is good for self-reflection. And we had our specific article. Now, I don't have this. You have to buy it. And all I got is the abstract. So I would want to get the article. And the other thing, too, is I can look at, they give you the references. And they give you a Google Scholar link to it. Learning through role-playing games, an approach for active learning and teaching. Looks interesting. I would kind of go down that rabbit hole. And here we go. So I have a nice link to that article. This study evaluates the use of role-playing games as a methodological approach for teaching cellular biology, assessing affection acquired knowledge. They did this with undergraduates. It's probably stretching it a bit. But you could probably extend it down as an example of a study with higher grades in terms of using of role playing. Cool. Now, it's not necessarily Dungeons and Dragons, but it is a role playing game. And then that could lead me not fantasy play. I could look up. Here we go. Micro world based role playing game development approach to engaging students. Okay, so this is just looking at role playing games in general. So what I'm doing is I'm looking for topics that look at a fantasy play as a concept, and then I'm looking at role playing games and Dungeons and Dragons. So if I were to kind of like I don't know, just a little sketch pad. Let's go. Okay. So I just need a whiteboard. Okay, so what have I got so far? So I'm looking at D&D. Let's go. So I'm looking at D and D as a concept. And coming into that, I can look at fantasy play, the concept. Role-playing games. As a concept. So I'm looking at just D&D in general, D&D, and then in the classroom, really. I'll just call it school. Now, role-playing games in general, fantasy play, this area will extend outside of D&D, but it'll feed into it. So there may be, I found research specific to D&D, but I can look at fantasy play, I can look at role-playing games and how they feed into D&D in the school. So these are kind of core concepts: fantasy play and education, role-playing games. I should put education here. And fantasy game, education. Sorry for my circle. Okay. And then there'll be, it's when I have that, so I'm getting an understanding of the topic itself. So these are, then underneath these will be the different factors. This will explain why it's important, what the value of fantasy play in general, benefits. Same for here, role-playing games, value, and the benefits. So I'm informing myself of the literature in terms of role-playing games, how they are used in education and their value, and what students get out of it, and then fantasy play education, what's the value of it, and what are the benefits. So the students may, it encourages imaginative play, and the benefits are it improves academic performance, one would hope. But that's what I would need to find from the research. I have not talked about Barry at all. So I'm not talking about Barry. I'm just looking at a very broad sense. Role-playing games, fantasy play games, or education, in education, and then I'm going to draw that back to D&D. And I'll have specific articles that are D&D related. Lose my cursor. Okay, I hope that's a start.